We also are looking at, and we ourselves participate in alternative pathways. Now, it is hard to get into Rensselaer, like it's hard to get into Case Western. But at the same time, we have articulation agreements with certain community colleges that allow students to go on, to begin college in a different way. And if they go down a particular track and perform at a certain level, they're able to transfer in to Rensselaer automatically and get advanced status. And there's an interesting phenomenon with that because the kinds of students we get, some of them are students who didn't have such strong backgrounds coming out of high school, and this allows them to get back on track. Others of them are actually quite good students, but maybe emotionally unprepared to come into the residential four-year college experience. And then there are yet others who have special learning issues, some with learning disabilities, and then for others it's a purely economic decision. And so we think that, within the context of being a selective institution, that we nonetheless can partner with other institutions that have a more direct impact on helping students get a leg up. So these are some of the things that we do.
Dr. Jackson, I congratulate you on one of the most lucid examples we've encountered in quite a while of a scientist bringing her orderly thinking to a policy matter.
Thank you.
And you used the phrase evidence-based medicine, and I would like to urge on you, excuse me, the concept of evidence-based politics. Because it holds the promise, as you mentioned, of pulling together two missions, having what science, technology, and engineering and mathematics can teach us about orderly thinking with the tremendous policy challenges that we face. And as we try to think what evidence-based politics would look like, one of the grave challenges is dealing with uncertainty and the very puzzling concept of proof in the political setting. And I offer you the challenge of the climate debate as the example du jour of how difficult it is to conduct a political discussion in an atmosphere of high uncertainty. But I'd like you to comment on the inspiration that you brought to me from your remarks.
Thank you. I always like easy questions. Well, first let me say there's evidence-based policy, and then perhaps there's evidence-based politics. And let me start and dispense with the one I know the least about, and that's evidence-based politics. But to me, real evidence-based politics is that if we have elected officials, whatever their stripes, do they get things done for the people they're elected to serve? That's the true evidence that one would like to see politics based on. But to what I think is the root of your question, I happen to have a little bit of experience on the evidence-based policy side from having been chair of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And there, we actually did have to deal with questions of uncertainty, because as well-engineered and designed as nuclear plants are, even mechanical systems fail and have failure modes, things that people don't anticipate. And then there are always the human factors when you have humans interacting with machines, with mechanical systems. And so in point of fact, the thing that I pushed and promulgated as chair of the NRC was what we call risk-informed performance-based regulation. And what it really meant was, in that case, bringing more rigorous risk analysis, in this case, in fact, probabilistic risk assessment, to bear in a more complete way in regulatory decision-making, and to develop all of the attendant methodologies, documents, inspection and reactor oversight programs to bear. And there, the usefulness of it was not that one could make an absolute prediction, but that one could think and begin to develop orderliness with regard to relative risk. and risk ranking and use that in terms of oversight, in terms of what things were most important relative to where risk and safety concerns were greatest. And so I would say that even if one is looking at areas where it's maybe even more difficult to think about uncertainty, like climate change, one can help people move through a disciplined process having to do with the preponderance of evidence and having that as a basis for informing decision-making. I think the scientific community has a role and perhaps is a little bit at fault with not helping the broader public think about questions of preponderance of risk and relative risk and so forth. At the same time, I spoke in my formal remarks about needing a more broadly scientifically literate populace, because when the two meet, we can have more informed decision-making. Thank you.
Dr. Jackson, welcome, and I think your life must be an inspiration for all of us, and particularly for very young people. I have the honor tomorrow of being a judge in a science fair at the primary school level in the City of Cleveland school system at a school called the Horizon Science, which I think is a STEM school. I'd like to give those kids some inspiration based on your life, and I wondered if you could share with us a few personal details, particularly of any challenges you may have faced as a woman or as a minority during your very early years in high school or before.
Well, you know, I mentioned that I'm a child of the post-Sputnik era, which means that I actually grew up in the 50s and 60s. So I grew up in Washington, D.C., and I actually began my formal education when the schools were segregated by law. And then they became desegregated as I went through school. And because of that, early on, I didn't have a lot of exposure to a broader range of types of people and to the ultimate kind of competition that I would face later. But then when the schools were integrated, then that came into the fore. Now, I am the kind of person who relishes that kind of challenge. And in the end, I did very well, which is how I happened to go to MIT. But when I got to MIT, then that was a little different, because in my freshman class, there were 43 women, and there were 5 African Americans. And most of the time I was an undergraduate at MIT, there were no more than about 10 African Americans. And so that was a bit of a challenge in the sense that I had fellow students who wouldn't sit next to me in class, who would not invite me into homework groups,